Good evening, I'm Jonathan Higgins.
And I'm Rich Carlson.
And we are Rail Fan. And good evening. It is December and it's the first Monday of the month, so we're live once again on the Train Aficionado channel.
And 2020 is almost over.
Thank goodness. So we have a great show for you this evening. Lots of things to talk about tonight, so make sure you sit in and get into a comfy chair and relax because we're going to have some history. We're also going to take a look at something that I discovered right here in the Carolinas for our Forgotten Railroads. Rich is going to take us on a journey in the 1980s. Is that right?
Yep.
And then we have some great photos from one of our viewers, Alicia. We're going to show those photos as well. So we've got a great show for you tonight. So let's kick it off. So look at this. We're already episode 4 of this season.
Yeah.
So let's take a look at what we've got going on. Here's the little preview for tonight. Railroad mergers. So we're going to look at the history of that. There's only 7 remaining Class 1 railroads. And then we've got Forgotten Railroads. The Circus rolled into town and nobody knew it. So that's going to be interesting.
Yep.
And Rich Carlson's going to take us on a rail fanning journey to 1989 to Livingston, Montana. So this should be a good show tonight. We do have some news things we're going to cover, but make sure you follow, like, and subscribe to the Train Aficionado social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. So make sure you hit the subscribe button since you're on the YouTube channel right now. And look at this. We've got some interesting news. CSX buys Pan Am Railways. On November the 30th, CSX agreed to purchase Pan Am Railways and integrate it into its system. Basically, this is the former Guilford Railroad system, including the Boston, Maine Central, and the Springfield Terminal. So some of the northern Massachusetts track rights there, and then going into Maine, into southern Maine. So this should be interesting. I mean...
Yeah. If you're aware of the history between Springfield Terminal and Guilford and all the rest of this stuff, they've got kind of a volatile history, especially with labor. Guilford started buying up railroads, and they wanted to try to break the unions. So they came up with the Springfield Terminal as the operating company for their other railroads to change the union rules. And they've had a lot of issues over the years, but I tell you what, I like their blue paint scheme. It's nothing fancy. It's just, paint everything in blue and put some writing on it. And I actually think it looks pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen some of their locomotives. I mean, it looks good. It looks clean.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to see that Pan Am's going to go away and it's going to be CSX. It was going to be a toss-up in between CSX or it was going to be Norfolk Southern. That's where I think it was going to go to. The interesting thing with Pan Am is, that was they handled the whole thing about the Hoosick Tunnel when they had that collapse.
Right.
Tunnel. So CSX is now going to take on that responsibility of maintaining that long, nearly 5-mile tunnel.
Well, and the other thing to remember, too, is that this is just the announcement of their intent to do it. It's going to take about a year before any practical integration of the system is going to happen. They have to get regulatory approval. It has to go through the boards, company boards and stuff. I assume that the company boards are already online. They wouldn't have announced it otherwise. But it still has to go with government approval. And once that happens, then it should. I don't see a whole lot of government problems with this. It's not going to be particularly anti-competitive. It's more of an end-to-end thing. I can see other short lines in the area perhaps objecting to it, but these days it's really about the only way for a large railroad to get any bigger.
Yeah. And the thing with CSX is they were losing some track coverage. They were New Bedford Fall River line, which is in southeastern Massachusetts. Any of you that are relatively familiar with Massachusetts, those two lines do have some freight service, and CSX lost that to the Mass Coastal, which maintains, which is the freight service down on the Cape. So going from Wareham, Massachusetts to Hyannis, they run the energy train, aka trash train, but they got to give it a nice clean energy train.
Oh, of course,
So they were doing that line, and then they ended up scooping up, clients on the New Bedford Fall River line, and then I'm not too sure if you're familiar with Old Colony or Bay Colony Railroad. Was a short line. They only got a little bit of track in Dartmouth, Massachusetts, and they originally Bay Colony originally had Mass Coastal's contract, and they lost it with the state. So CSX lost, New Bedford Fall River, and then it seems like they're weaseling their way into, not weaseling, but they're getting their way into
working their way into
the way into Mass Coastal is sat in the Taunton area, and starting to take over all that southeastern Massachusetts stuff. So CSX, is going to go north, and they're probably letting this happen because it's the contracts are not huge, and they can get a great deal of money from these contracts that Pan Am has already have. The interesting thing, the line where the Hoosick Tunnel goes through, Norfolk Southern has a train that runs on that line. Now, is that going to still stay around, or is that going to go away?
Typically on mergers, any trackage rights or overhead right or haulage rights that applied before the merger will usually remain in place post-merger unless the railroads involved agree otherwise. So there might, as part of the approval process, in order to get Norfolk Southern to not object to it, they may offer better terms. Say, hey, instead of having just one train a day, now we'll let you have 2 trains a day to go through there, or some other type of arrangements. It's not that unusual for that type of thing to happen. And there are some trackage rights that agreements that have been going back centuries, 5 mergers ago. So,
which is really interesting. So I'm curious to see what's going to all happen with that. And as you said, it's going to be a good year or so before we actually see this finalized.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the other thing, CN, Rail Heritage Units, Rich. Tell us a little bit about this.
So the Canadian National has bought several railroads over the last 15, 20 years, in which we're going to get into a little bit later on. And like the Norfolk Southern and like some of these other railroads have done, they have painted up heritage units in the same paint schemes as some of their predecessors. So not only a couple of their CN, some heritage things for the CN itself, but they have one for the Wisconsin Central, the Illinois Central, the Grand Trunk, the BC Rail, and the Elgin Joliet and Eastern. So, and they are pretty darn good recreations of those paint schemes. And the funny thing about this is on all the railroads that they have done the heritage, there are still locomotives in those paint schemes left over from the mergers from however many, 10 or 15 years ago, however long these railroads have been part of the CN. There are still units running around in BC Rail, IC paint especially. There's a couple yard units still running around the WC paint. And, and here they are doing heritage units in those paint schemes. So,
I mean, it's really awesome when they do that because, it gives rail fans something to chase or something to look forward to for additional power out there. Unfortunately, CSX has gotten involved with some special paint schemes, but it's been stickers is what they've been doing. for some of it.
Yeah, let's make a heritage unit. Let's slap a sticker on the front. Yeah. It's not the same. This whole thing started with the Union Pacific, and they did some heritage units. They weren't faithful recreations of the prior railroad paint schemes, but like for the Chicago Northwestern, which is my favorite railroad of all time, they used the same colors, yellow and green, and the Herald, and it was just kind of a not really a heritage unit, but a commemorative unit that commemorates the Chicago Northwestern or the Southern Pacific or the MOPAC or the Katy or whoever. And it wasn't their exact paint schemes, but the same colors and the emblems and that. But what they did, they took it one step further, is they renumbered the locomotive to the year that railroad joined the Union Pacific.
Oh, wow.
And so the 1995 is the Chicago Northwestern year, because that's the year that the Northwestern was taken over by the Union Pacific. Norfolk Southern then did their 30 heritage units in the paint schemes of 30 different railroads that made up the Norfolk Southern, Conrail, the Pennsy, the New York Central, the Central of Georgia, the original Norfolk Southern, which was a short line that was absorbed by Norfolk and Western.
Yeah, I mean, it was a really cool paint scheme, too. It's a red versus this black, that you would typically see.
So they, for them, what they did is they had a rail fan that actually came up with the paint schemes and chose the paint schemes and found the documentation necessary to do that. And then the CSX did their decals, and now the CP Rail has jumped whole hog into this as well with their military units, and their other commemorative units, which I've done a really nice job, and I really like them. And their old CP paint schemes with the script and all the rest. Oh, beautiful, beautiful units. And then the BNSF did the same thing the CSX did. They slapped a couple stickers on about 10 locomotives of some of their predecessor roads. So, yeah, Norfolk, like Carmen said, Norfolk Southern kills it when it comes to heritage units. Yeah, I mean, that is the gold standard of heritage units. Kudos to the CN for what they've done, and now the CP, which has gone a little bit different. Those were the best. I think the Union Pacific was pretty cool, and the BNSF and CSX kind of like, yeah, okay, fine.
Yeah, it's just amazing just being able to see those units. So some of them need definitely a wash, or they need a touch up on paint. That's what I'm seeing a lot of the Norfolk Southern Heritage units. The other thing that we didn't get in on the slideshow this week is just coming out that the Union Pacific 4141 locomotive will be permanently displayed at the Bush Library.
Yeah. So that was in planning for a long time.
Yeah, but that's we've got some stories coming out, that it's officially going to happen, and that's going to be really really awesome to be able to see that locomotive there. And yet again, he was President 41, so they renumbered the locomotive, so it would be 4141.
Yeah, and then that was the same locomotive they used to carry his body when after he died, but they came up with that locomotive while he was still alive. Yeah, and he was that important to the Union Pacific. I mean, he really helped them out. And regardless of your politics, it was kind of a neat tribute, and especially after he died, to use that locomotive and on his funeral train was kind of a class act. So
that's for sure. So let's continue on here with the slideshow for this evening. Here's another interesting thing. While you were out and about, you saw these magazines.
Yeah, so I was up in Flagstaff rail fanning on a week ago Saturday. And then Sunday, I stopped in at the bookstore and saw on the magazine rack these two magazines sitting right next to each other. And it was like, well, wait a minute. They got the same article in both magazines. So I ended up buying them both, and I got home, and they're different takes on, but on the same area. I just thought it was really crazy that the two biggest railfan magazines came up with articles very similar to them in the same month as their cover articles. So it's kind of fun.
Yeah, it's got to be a huge coincidence, and I'm sure
Yeah.
when they saw, oops.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the thing is magazines are done months in advance. I mean, these magazines come out in the first week of November, and they're dated December, which means they probably go to bed probably the first part of October on the printed ones. The virtual magazines, they can be done a lot quicker because you can work on it up to 5 minutes before you send it out. But a printed one's got to go to a printer. It's got to go to offset printing and all the rest of the stuff. So the lead time on them is much greater. And they were stuck with that by the time they realized the other guys that did the same thing.
Yeah. Sure.
There is another article in the Trains magazine. The article listed there about the Penn Central. If you're interested in railroad mergers and the causes and why they did some of these mergers, read that article. It's a good read on what was going on back in the 60s and 70s when the Pennsylvania and the New York Central were starting to go, belly up, and they kind of had a merger to, try to save it. They made mistakes, and both railroads owned profitable subsidiaries, the Norfolk and Western and the Chessie system at the time. And if they would have merged with their subsidiaries, they may have survived versus going through the Penn Central debacle.
That's for sure. But definitely, if you haven't picked these up, pick them up. Two great magazines, Rail Fan and Railroad, and Trains magazines. Two great publications. They'll be able to check out. And they're both highlighting Arizona this month. Go figure. So let's continue on with the slideshow presentation. So we're going to talk about railroad mergers, the remaining 7 Class 1 railroads. So let's take a look at some history today. Rich, why don't you dive into this slide here?
So first off, let's define a Class 1 railroad. A Class 1 railroad is the largest railroads out there, and in order to be a Class 1 railroad, you have to have X amount of revenue, and that changes from time to time, and it keeps on going up as inflation goes up. But as it turns out, there are 7 Class 1 railroads, and then a Class 2 railroads are between this number and that number, and those are your regional lines. And so forth. And the reason that they're classified that way is that different class railroads have different reporting requirements. So a Class 1 railroad has to report this, this, and this to the government. A Class 2 doesn't have to report that, but it does have to do this and this. So there are some differences that are necessary there. So of the remaining railroads, there are 7 of them that are Class 1s. And the Union Pacific and the BNSF out west, the KCS in the Midwest, the Canadian National, and the CP Rail, which both have extensive operations in Canada, but also in the central part of the U.S. And then out east, you got the CSX and Norfolk Southern. And the railroads have been running for 190 years in the U.S., and mergers started almost right away, and they just kept on going and going and going. And every railroad now is the result of hundreds of mergers over the years. And the modern era of mergers started in 1947, and that was when the Gulf Mobile in Ohio merged with the Alton route, which was the Alton route was a road between Chicago, St. Louis, and Kansas City. The Gulf Mobile in Ohio ran from down south, Louisiana and Mississippi, up to St. Louis and Kansas City area, and now they had a route between the Gulf and Chicago.
Yeah, I mean, it's just amazing to see. I remember old Conrail. Back in the '80s and the early '90s. Then it got swallowed up by some of it got swallowed up by Norfolk Southern, some of it got swallowed up by CSX. which we'll definitely talk about that. So here's the big seven right here on the screen with all their logos. I mean, they got some pretty classy logos there, wouldn't you say?
Oh, yeah. I think, well, the Union Pacific has been around the longest, and anybody who merges with the Union Pacific becomes part of Union Pacific. Everything else, the names are fungible. So if the BNSF merges with the Canadian National, they can make a whole different name. And the same thing with CP Rail, CSX, all the others. But anybody who merges with Union Pacific becomes part of Union Pacific. And one of the neat things is that the Union Pacific, the corporate structure, the company behind the name, actually isn't the original Union Pacific. It's actually, the current one is actually the original Rio Grande. What happened was back years ago, the Rio Grande bought the Southern Pacific. But since the Southern Pacific was much better known, they renamed the company to the Southern Pacific. And then when the Union Pacific bought out the big new Southern Pacific, they used the corporate structure of the Southern Pacific as the corporate structure for the combined company and renamed it, of course, Union Pacific. And they had done the same thing years before when they took over the Missouri Pacific. The corporate structure of Missouri Pacific was better suited for their operations. So the Union Pacific, it actually was like the MOPAC, the Missouri Pacific took over the Union Pacific, in name only, and then they changed the name of the company from Missouri Pacific to Union Pacific. So that's just kind of an oddball thing that happened. Whereas the Union Pacific was actually the Missouri Pacific, and then after that became the Southern Pacific, and then they just changed the name.
Super cool. We're getting some comments about some of the logos. Love the Norfolk Southern logo. Yeah, that's pretty cool with the horse. And
that's classic. Yeah.
And then the Union Pacific logo is quite classic as well.
Yeah.
And
I like the KCS one. I mean, that one is old fashioned. It's like right out of the 30s.
Yeah, and it's got it's got two font styles, as you see there. It definitely has that look and feel.
Yeah, and the CN, they call that the wet noodle.
Oh, the CN.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, because it's
it's the squiggle. Yeah. And then the BNSF, they're a very well-run railroad, a very good company, but they need a better image. And CP Rail, they call that the multi-mark. Actually, they've gone away from that particular logo now, but that's still the classic one. And I don't know what they're trying to do with the CSX. I guess it's a boxcar on wheels.
Yeah, which you don't see too many boxcars because it's mostly the intermodal containers. Now is the primary thing. I mean, occasionally I see along the Charlotte division here for Norfolk Southern, occasionally, mixed freight. Oh, there's some boxcars.
Yeah,
and it's a rarity that you see them.
Chris has got a good question. Bring up his last comment.
About Amtrak. Amtrak is a passenger service, so it's not going to be a part of the Big Seven freight services.
So when they defined Class 1 railroads, there was actually an asterisk on that. When the government made that distinction of what a Class 1 railroad is, they say every railroad that has revenues of above this limit plus Amtrak. So Amtrak is a Class 1 railroad, but it's not considered one of the Big Seven because for the most part, they don't own their own track. Yeah, they own some track. They own their equipment and the employees, but for the most part, most of the time they're operating on other railroads. So yeah, technically they are a Class 1, but they're over there someplace.
Yeah, they're not in the big they're not at the big railroad table. They're at the kids table.
Right. Yeah. They're the ones sitting on the eating at the tray table next to the big people's table. So
So this is really interesting. So let's dive into some of the history this evening, and we'll start with the BNSF. I'll let you take away this slide because you're familiar with them.
Sure. So the BNSF, and again, we only picked some of the more important and more recent things from the merger. So there's a lot more information on these railroads that has occurred. These are just the highlights. So back in the 1970s, or back in the 1960s and before, the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy was actually owned by the Great Northern and the Northern Pacific. They co-owned it. It was called a condominium. They both owned the railroad together, and then they use that as their Chicago connection from Minneapolis. They also own the Seattle, Portland, and Spokane, Seattle, Spokane, Portland, and Seattle, or Seattle, Portland, and Spokane. I can't remember which what went to one. And so they had been trying to merge those lines for decades. And finally, in 1970, they finally got the approval to do it. And so they formed the Burlington Northern. And it was originally to be called the Great Northern Pacific and Burlington Lines. And thankfully, they wouldn't have had enough room on the top of the paper to keep that name on there. So they made it Burlington Northern, and it stuck. And then about 10 years later, the BN then absorbed the St. Louis, San Francisco, or otherwise known as the Frisco. A few years later, the Santa Fe, which was still independent at the time, they merged in with the TP&W, only to sell it off again a few years later. So they bought it and then they got rid of it. The TP&W, Toledo, Peoria, and Western, was at that time owned half by Santa Fe and half by Conrail. And it was a bridge line between Western Illinois, across Illinois, and into Indiana. And then so the Santa Fe took over the most of it. They gave part of it to Conrail, and then they sold it off, and now it's still an independent short line. Then in 1995, the BNSF was merged. The BNSF was formed when the Burlington Northern and Santa Fe merged together. There was some people who thought the BNSF actually stood for the Big New Santa Fe, or Buy Norfolk Southern Fast. But
Norfolk Southern Fast.
Yeah. And funny enough, BNSF is actually now the official name of the railroad. It's not Burlington Northern Santa Fe. It's BNSF is the actual name of the company.
I see.
Randy had a good question. Bring up Randy's comment.
Yeah.
So why did so many railroads use the word Pacific in their name? And that's very important to what we're talking about tonight. Back in the around the Civil War, in the 1850s and 1860s, it was westward expansion. The U.S. at the time was mostly east of Mississippi, and they were expanding to the west. And so they started building railroads from Chicago or Kansas City or Omaha out to the west. And the target was the Pacific Ocean. So you had the Northern Pacific, you had the Southern Pacific, you had the Central Pacific, you had the Union Pacific, you had the, all these Pacific railroads, the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific, all these because they were going to the Pacific coast. So that's why they all had the word Pacific in their name.
Very cool. That's what I was almost sure that what it was, but I did. You confirm that. Do you want to go to the next question that's just below that?
Yeah. So Vance asks why some trains include engines from multiple companies. So you would, and that's actually very common to see trains. Like I watch cameras out here all the time, and through Flagstaff, which is my favorite camera, it's not unusual to see Union Pacific, Ferromex, Kansas City Southern, CSX, Norfolk Southern. The thing is diesel locomotives these days are just pretty much plug and play. You can take a diesel from one railroad and put it on another railroad, and it's not uncommon for a train to have 2 or 3 different railroads locomotives in it, because they are really all are just they're just power bricks for the most part. Typically, you'll have the home railroad's locomotive normally leading. Sometimes they have different communications equipment or PTC gear, but it's very, very common to see that. And a couple things happen. The railroads have agreements where they can have run-through trains, or they'll take, like the BNSF might have a train that has to serve something that's 10 miles inside of Union Pacific territory. Instead of stopping the train at the border and changing the power, the locomotives, they'll just run that train right to the destination, and they'll bill the Union Pacific for how many horsepower hours are used. But instead of them paying bills back and forth, when it gets to a certain point and Union Pacific owes the BNSF a whole bunch of horsepower hours, they'll send 20 locomotives over to the BNSF and let them work out there for a month, and they'll run on the BNSF account. Sometimes it might be a run-through train where the train might go 500 miles on Norfolk Southern and 700 miles on the Union Pacific. They'll just run whatever railroad power is available on it, and they'll figure out the math later.
Very interesting. Well, we've got some more questions there, but what we'll do is we'll dive back into those in a little bit. So it's now time for Union Pacific, Rich. Some history here. Since this is out in your neck of the woods, I'll let you take this one as well.
Sure. So in 1982, the Union Pacific took over the Missouri Pacific and the Western Pacific pretty much at the same time. Interestingly, what they did on that is when they started painting some of the power, there were still some financial things going on. So you would have a former Missouri Pacific or Western Pacific locomotive in full UP paint, but instead of Union Pacific, it would say Missouri Pacific or Western Pacific on it. And then that lasted for a couple of years until they got the T's crossed and the I's dotted, and then they changed it to Union Pacific. And then a few years later, they took over the Katy. The Union Pacific took over the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas, although also known as the Katy. At the same time, and separate, the Southern Pacific was taken over by the Rio Grande, but then they changed the name back to the Southern Pacific because the Southern Pacific had a much more well-known name. The next year, the Southern Pacific bought a part of the railroad called the Chicago, Missouri, and Western. Not the Chicago and Northwestern, but Chicago, Missouri, and Western. It was kind of a familiar, similar name. And that was the old Alton route. Remember we talked about the Alton route earlier, from St. Louis to Chicago. And they bought that St. Louis to Chicago line as part of the Southern Pacific. So now the SP, who had never been into Chicago, now had a line into Chicago. A couple years later, the Union Pacific took over my favorite railroad, the Chicago Northwestern, and that now became the eastern end of the Union Pacific. And then the next year, the Union Pacific took over the Southern Pacific. So they've got to pretty much where they are now, which is they go just about everywhere west of Chicago. And along with the BNSF, between those two railroads, they pretty much blanket the entire western United States.
Wow. That is crazy. And here we go, Kansas City's Southern rail lines. And this is another one that I've never rail fanned. The only two that I've rail fanned is Norfolk Southern and CSX. So I'll let you continue on.
All right, sure. So the KCS is the smallest of the Class 1 railroads. And they go from Kansas City down to the Gulf. And they have acquired some other trackage. So in 1994, the KCS bought, which was then called the Mid-South Railroad. The Mid-South Railroad was lines down in Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, and such that were former Gulf, Mobile, Ohio, and Illinois Central lines that were cast off as part of the purge of branch lines. So Mid-South bought up those lines, got them fixed up, started making some money on it, and KCS says, yeah, okay, I can deal with that. And they bought them out, and that became part of the KCS lines. The next year, they bought the Tex-Mex Railroad, the Texas Mexican, which was a railroad in Texas that did interchange to Mexico. And they're kind of playing the long game here, which we'll go into in the last part of it. But the next year after that, they bought the Gateway Western, which was the other half of that Chicago, Missouri, and Western that the Southern Pacific didn't want. So they split that between the two of them. And that was the line from near Springfield, Illinois to Kansas City. So that line became part of the KCS, and the rest of it became part of SP. And then in 1998, they bought most of the Panama Canal Railroad, which doesn't connect to anything else. It's just the railroad that runs through the Panama Canal Zone. But it was a very important line for them because it bridges traffic between the Atlantic and the Pacific through the Panama Canal Zone. And not all the traffic that goes through Panama goes through the canal. So sometimes the boats will pull up on one side of the from the Pacific side or from the Atlantic side, the Gulf side, unload their containers or whatever onto trains. The train will bring it across Panama, and then they'll load it on different boats on the other side. So,
wow.
And then in 2004, the other half of the long game played out, and they bought the TFM, which was now known as the KCS in Mexico, and that was one of the large Canadian railroads, or Mexico, the other side of the country, south side. So they bought the TFM, which I'm trying to remember what my Spanish is very poor. So, but that was one of the three big railroads in Mexico, and they bought that, and now they pretty much go from Illinois through the heartland of the U.S. down to New Orleans, and then they got the lines going down to Mexico, and then they cover a lot of Mexico, plus they get the lines in Panama.
Wow. So CP Rail is another one interesting here with some history dipping down to the 80s to the 90s. So tell us about this, Rich.
All right. So the Soo Line, which is now part of CP Rail, but at that time it was independently run, but the CPA was the majority stockholder. So they were still an independent railroad. They bought the Minneapolis, Northfield, and Southern, which was a terminal railroad in the Minneapolis area. And then in 1985, the Soo Line, which is still independently run at the time, buys the remains of the Milwaukee Road. The Milwaukee Road had gone bankrupt, and then the Soo Line bought what's left of the Milwaukee Road after a big fight with the Chicago Northwestern and the Grand Trunk. All three of them wanted the Milwaukee Road, and the Soo Line ended up winning that battle. A couple years later, they spin off their old Soo Line trackage and some of the Milwaukee Road trackage into the Wisconsin Central, which we're going to talk about on the CN side. And then 1990, the Soo Line merged into the CP Rail, and of course that included the former Milwaukee Road track. So now the Soo Line is just CP Rail these days. And then they bought the D&H, the Delaware and Hudson, which is in your backyard. Was in your backyard. They spun that out in later to the St. Lawrence and Hudson. And when they started making money with that, they said, oh, wait a minute, we're making money on that. So they ended up buying it back. So that St. Lawrence and Hudson was only independent for a short time and came back. And then in 2008, they bought the Dakota, Minnesota, and Eastern, and the Iowa, Chicago, and Eastern, which was basically former Milwaukee Road track and Northwestern track. So that was stuff that was cast off by one railroad and bought by another class one after a few years being independent, which is kind of a recurring theme these days.
Okay. Well, we got CN history now.
All right, so the CN started off. They bought a lot of stuff, especially in the Midwest, over a span of about 10 years. So in 1998, first off, they bought the Illinois Central, which was the line from Chicago down to New Orleans and some of the branch lines. And everybody knows the Illinois Central from the song Willie Nelson did, oh God, I can't remember Steve Goodman wrote the song "City of New Orleans," and that was about an Illinois Central passenger train. And then Steve Goodman did the original recording of it, and then Willie Nelson had a huge hit with that song. And then a couple of years later, they bought the Wisconsin Central, which we spoke about a little bit earlier. The Wisconsin Central was formed in 1987 when they bought lines that the Soo Line was getting rid of. Mostly former Soo Line track and some Milwaukee Road track. And in the meanwhile, the Wisconsin Central had purchased the Algoma Central, the Fox River Valley, Green Bay and Western, and a bunch of, on that. And now all of a sudden the CN buys them. And so all those railroads now became part of the CN, which some of this track was controlled by the CP Rail, and now it's owned by CN. And then a couple years later, they bought the Duluth, Mesabi and Iron Range, which is up in the Duluth area, and the BLE. Now, at that time, the CN already controlled the Duluth, Winnipeg, and Pacific, the DWP, and the Grand Trunk Western. So that now all those are part of the CN family. And then the next year, 2004, they bought the BC Rail, which British Columbia Railroad. And then in 2008, they bought the Elgin, Joliet, and Eastern, and they merged it into their WC subsidiary, which is still a paper company. And that one's a lot more important than it would seem. EJ&E is a relatively small railroad. It runs from Waukegan, Illinois, around Chicago, and then into Indiana. And the reason that's so important is because it ties in all the other CN lines. The former Wisconsin Central, the former Illinois Central line to Omaha, the CN's Grand Trunk line, and the Illinois Central all tie into that. So now they can take a train from here, run it around on the EJ&E, and then take it down there without having to go into Chicago. Huge pickup for the Canadian National.
Yeah, I mean, I could totally get that. Just buying certain track lines, you can get some huge benefits.
Mm-hmm.
So Norfolk Southern, looks like they started in their history here on the timeline in 1959, where Norfolk Western buys the Virginian Railway. Virginian holds a special place for me because it was the first heritage unit that I was able to get was the Virginian, and I got that over in Pennsylvania. And
don't you have a Virginian thing in your background someplace usually?
Yeah, I don't have it. Oh, it's right here. Here it is.
There you go.
Yeah,
I knew you had something.
It's a cool logo. It is certainly
a
cool logo. I mean, you look at it, even shows that, the dates here, from 1907 to 1959.
Yep.
So I definitely want to get an N-scale locomotive or two for there. 1964, a few years down the road, Norfolk Western merges Wabash and Nickel Plate. And then in 1976, Conrail formed from Penn Central and others. Penn Central, which we're both familiar with, ran through the Horseshoe Curve for many years. And then Conrail ran through there. So we see some of these classic pictures, of the Horseshoe Curve. We've seen, the Penn Central, and then we've seen, Conrail running through there. And I believe you told me that when Conrail took over operations to the Horseshoe Curve, they took out one of the middle tracks, making it from 4 to 3.
Yeah, they took out track number 3, which the first time I went there was still it was Conrail, and I'd been there several times under Conrail. And the first time I was there, they still had the 4 tracks all the way through there, and they used all 4 of them. And then they took out one of the tracks, and now that's used as a service road. So if you take a look at it, you'll see 1 track, the service road, and 2 more tracks.
Yeah, and then you could definitely see where that track was. There's no ifs or buts about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
1982, a few years down the road, Norfolk Southern was formed and merged Norfolk Western and Norfolk Southern, so they became all together. And then the big thing that I remember is 1998, NS and Norfolk Southern and CSX basically buy and split Conrail. I mean, you look at, so for example, Horseshoe Curve, that line through there is Norfolk Southern. Conrail was operating in Massachusetts. They became CSX. So it really depended on the region how it got split.
Yeah. The way it turned out was, for the most part, the Norfolk Southern got former Pennsylvania lines, and the CSX got former New York Central lines, which was kind of interesting because remember when I spoke earlier about that Trains article about the Penn Central debacle?
Yep.
At that time, the Norfolk and Western was a subsidiary of the Pennsylvania Railroad, or controlled by the Pennsylvania Railroad. The Chessie system, which was half of the CSX, was a subsidiary of New York Central, or controlled by the New York Central. And so now it's the child taking care of the parents,
Exactly. Let's dive into this a little bit more. So we're going to go into CSX's history. As we can see, the Chessie and Seaboard comes into the fold now. In 1976, Conrail was formed, and Penn Central and others, bought out Penn Central and others. In 1980, CSX was formed by the merger of the Chessie and the Seaboard, holding both of those companies. Now, if I understand correctly, that's how they got CSX, was from merging those names.
Yeah, the Chessie and Seaboard multiplied makes it bigger. So it was just the holding companies that merged. The railroad operations didn't merge until 1987, though.
And then we had, in 1989, we had, in 1998, we had Norfolk Southern and CSX split Conrail. Mm-hmm. And then as of 2020, we added to this, they announced that they're going to buy the Pan Am Railway. So this should be interesting to see what's going to happen, with all these 7, will there be 6? Well, I guess we'll have to find out. Some mergers that never were. So, Rich, this is a slide that you really worked on. So let's dive into this here. So we see that Union Pacific Rock Island. What was that all about?
The Union Pacific in the 1960s, they tried to buy the Rock Island because the Union Pacific at that time ended at Omaha, and they didn't go east to Omaha, and they wanted to get to Chicago in the worst way. You can't be a railroad and not go into Chicago. So what it was is there were several railroads that all went to Omaha from Chicago. The Rock Island, the Milwaukee Road, the Illinois Central, the Wabash, the Northwestern. And they all went to Omaha to kind of feed at the end of the Union Pacific all that traffic. Well, the Union Pacific wanted to have their own line to Chicago, so they tried to buy the Rock Island, which was, they figured they'd get that the cheapest. The problem was that would have made the Union Pacific so much stronger than everybody else, and probably would have bankrupted the Northwestern and the Milwaukee Road and probably everybody else at that time. And all those railroads were not doing particularly good anyway. So they fought it tooth and nail, especially the Northwestern. And they fought it tooth and nail and fought it and fought it and fought it. And by the time the federal government, mid-70s, finally gave their approval to the Union Pacific to buy the Rock Island, the Union Pacific said, oh, forget this. The Rock Island is just total trash now. They stopped doing maintenance, and it was just, the Rock Island was a total mess. You remember this? Read the stories about the Penn Central where they're having derailments of trains that weren't even moving. Mm-hmm. They had the same thing happen on the Rock Island. They weren't doing any maintenance. It was falling apart. The only reason they kept things going was they were selling off everything that wasn't bolted down. Wow. And yeah, it was a total mess. And so the Union Pacific finally said, forget it. And the Rock Island immediately went bankrupt. And it was the largest railroad bankruptcy that resulted in a total shutdown of the railroad. The entire railroad shut down. All the locomotives were sent here. All the cars were sent there. And they cut up the railroad into different chunks. The Northwestern got part. The Milwaukee, not the Milwaukee Road, but the SP and the UP got parts. Part of it became short lines. And their main line between Chicago and Omaha became part of the Iowa Railroad, and it's now called the Iowa Interstate. And they're actually making a good go of it. And the Northwestern got the Kansas City line, and the MOPAC got some lines in Missouri, and they pretty much just cut it up. It sold off all the locomotives, sold off all the cars, scrapped whatever nobody bought, and that was it for the Rock Island.
Wow. And then it looks like they were trying to do a mega merger with CN and BNSF. in the early, what was it, in the 90s.
Yeah.
But that didn't happen.
Yeah, no, the government said, nah, ain't going to happen. And they were going to have some problems. Even if the U.S. government had approved it, the Canadian government would have had issues because there's a law in Canada that says that a Canadian company has to own the Canadian railroads. You cannot own, a foreign country cannot own the railroads in Canada. So if there was going to be a merger, it would have to be headquartered in Canada. So the CN would have been headquartered in Montreal. So they would have had to do that. So it might have been kind of a name-only headquarters in Montreal, but they would have had to do that.
It would have been something they would have had to do on paper to make it look.
Yeah, and then the Canadian government would have to approve it as well. But that's all right. The U.S. government said, no, you're not going to do it anyways. And then they put a moratorium on mergers. And then after that moratorium expired, that's when the CN bought the Wisconsin Central.
Wow. And then it looks like C and CW and the Milwaukee Road was another merger that never happened.
Yeah, so back in the 60s and 70s when we were talking about the Rock Island thing, the Chicago Northwestern and the Milwaukee Road, which were pretty much ran everywhere the other guy did, back and forth. And they tried to merge each other with each other, and it never happened. They put together some pretty good plans, and they had agreed to do so, but it just never happened. It probably was a good thing because it probably would have been like the Penn Central. Again, it wasn't an end-to-end merger, which has a lot of benefits. It was a merger of people, it would have been kind of a mess. And whose track are they going to abandon? And there would have been a lot more track abandoned, and it probably would have gone bankrupt pretty quickly anyway.
Yeah, I mean, especially as you said, there was a lot of redundancies of the two lines. It just becomes. I mean, it's a lot of real estate if you think about it. If you're abandoning, like a redundant line of the competitor, or at this point, if they merged. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, what a crazy.
Well, I mean, the Milwaukee Road was already headed to bankruptcy already. They did go bankrupt a few years later, and the Northwestern wasn't far behind them. And if it wasn't for the coal lines opening up out west for the Northwestern, they probably would have gone bankrupt as well.
Here's another one: the ATSF and the Southern Pacific in the 80s. Yep. What's this all about?
So the Santa Fe and the Southern Pacific agreed to merge, and they were so positive that this was going to happen that they even started painting locomotives, and that was the old Kodachrome paint scheme. It would look like the red and yellow of Kodachrome, and the Southern Pacific was going to be called the SPSF, Southern Pacific Santa Fe, and so the Southern Pacific painted locomotives in the same paint scheme, and they had the SP on the left side of the locomotive. And so that they could add SF to it as soon as the merger got approved. The Santa Fe did the same thing, same paint, but they put SF on the right side so they could add SP to the left side once it was approved. And it was like, this is going to happen. There's nothing you can do. It's a fait accompli. It's going to happen. And then the government said, nah, ain't going to happen. And now they're like, oh, well, now what? So they said, no, it's not going to happen. So the Santa Fe, which was at that time still very profitable, it was just they just needed to grow. The Southern Pacific was not particularly profitable at the time, and then they ended up going to the getting bought out by the Rio Grande, and then another 10 years later, the Santa Fe and the Burlington Northern merged into the BNSF.
And then the final one, CP and Norfolk Southern, or CP or CSX. It sounds like neither one of them wanted it.
Yeah, so the Canadian Pacific last 5-10 years tried to take over the Norfolk Southern, and they tried to take over the CSX. Even though the CP rail is the second smallest of the Class 1s, the only one that's smaller than them is the KCS. They tried to take over kind of the ant swallowing the anteater type of thing. And both CSX and Norfolk Southern said, forget it, ain't going to happen, and basically told him to go away and stop bothering me, kid. And the CP just was kind of like told to leave, and they did.
Oh, wow. So crazy. And then let's take a look at the mergers that might be. What about possible mergers in the future? Logical to the next merger would be east to west. Also, could the U.S. and Canada, legally make it so it could happen, where, and then assuming all the legal stuff, could it work out with some of the possibilities? I mean, take a look at UP, CSX, or BNSF and Norfolk Southern.
Yeah. The thing is if you're going to have a U.S. merger with the 4 big U.S. railroads, it's going to have to be pretty much an east to west, because there's no way they're going to allow the UP to merge with the BNSF or the Norfolk Southern to merge with the CSX, because now you've got no competition. They own everything out west or they own everything out east. The only way they're going to have any allowable mergers is to have a Western railroad merge with an Eastern railroad. So the most logical one...
Join the route together, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Have an end-to-end. So the most logical one would seem to be the Union Pacific and the CSX, and then the BNSF and the Norfolk Southern. Those company pairs have relatively similar management styles, and they would mesh a little bit better. It could go the other way around, but I just think it's less likely. I don't think we'll ever see this, or at least not anytime soon. But, I mean, it's possible. And Dale asks what up the MRL into the BNSF. I don't think that's going to happen. The MRL is happy doing what they're doing, and the BNSF is happy with what the MRL is doing. So the Montana Rail Link was a spinoff from the Burlington Northern, where when the Burlington Northern merged, they had 2 lines going through Montana. The one up north and one towards the south, which the one towards the south was actually the Northern Pacific. And they sold that off. Well, they leased the trackage off to the Montana Rail Link. And we're going to talk about them in a few minutes.
Okay.
And then, of course, the UPNS and the BNSF CSX, which is possible but not likely. The CN and the BNSF, they tried it once before. Why not try again? Yeah. And again, the CP is they want to be part of something, but I think the only thing that they're going to end up getting would be the KCS, and they don't really need it because they could probably deal with KCS, but I don't think it's going to happen.
Yeah, some interesting things here, that's for sure, for possible mergers. Let's continue on with the show. We're reaching the top of the hour here, hour number 2, and we're going to dive into Forgotten Railroads. The circus that rolled into town and nobody knew it. I'm going to, there's the full blog entry, as you can see in the description of this broadcast on YouTube, so you can read the blog entry from Train Aficionado. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview on it. So, basically, Ringling Brothers Barnum Bailey Circus, is no longer in operation. They custom built all their rail coaches and flatbed cars and so on. So a lot of them were sold to museums. Some were sold to railroads, or they were sold to the North Carolina DOT. Purchased 9 of the cars back in 2017 and have done nothing with them. They basically stored them on State Railroad line, which is a dead-end line. They just basically pushed it on down this track beyond the point where the cars are parked. The rest of the line is abandoned. Yeah. So there was a newspaper article that was in the Carolina Journal that exposed that this nearly $400,000 investment is sitting in the woods getting graffiti, as you can see here, and pretty good graffiti to might add.
Oh, you mean that's not the way they came?
No, that's graffiti.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of photos in the blog entry. What I did was they took off all the decals off of the cars. So they stripped it down, but I was able to see what the actual car numbers were when they were Ringling Brothers property. So I have them all listed there, what type of cars they were. All the cars were locked. A lot of the windows were busted out, but they've been keeping an eye on it, boarding it up. The problem is it's just sitting in the woods. They're not doing anything. And I don't understand. So North Carolina DOT was going to redo these cars into passenger coaches. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't understand why they would do that. It's going to cost them tons of money to undo what Ringling Brothers did to the cars, because the cars were, some of them are workshops, for repairing equipment. Some of them are sleeping quarters for the various performers. So they would have to undo that, rip everything out, then make it into a passenger coach, which didn't make any sense. As far as I know, they're still in Spring Hope, North Carolina. They've been sitting there for 3 years, doing nothing. They are tucked away down in the woods. I saw this article posted, so my wife and I, we made the over 2-hour drive just to go see them. Walked down the railroad line, took photographs of every single one of these cars, logged every single one of them. Mm-hmm. And we weren't the only ones. People were interested to see where their nearly $400,000 of taxpayers' money is sitting in the woods. So it's hidden on state home track. Who knows what will happen at this point? The thing that I recommended in the blog entry is, why is it not at the North Carolina Transportation Museum? No. I mean, it would be safer. And the other thing, too, if they're not going to do anything with this, these cars are still in decent shape. What would you think of this, Rich? This would be an awesome museum display if they got everything, intact in the inside. You could see the sleeping quarters of the Ringling Brothers performers. The other cool thing that the museum could do, which I believe I recommended, is they could have an overnight fundraiser, sleep in the quarters as if the performers could be a big money maker for the museum.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
But the thing is,
I don't know what they're thinking of. They were thinking of when they bought these things. You're right. I think the rehabilitation costs would have been tremendous.
I mean, it cost them, I think it was for the fleet, because there's a red fleet and there's a blue fleet. So there's basically, when Ringling Brothers was operating, there was 2 huge train sets traveling, crisscrossing across the whole entire United States. I ended up chasing the circus train when it last went through Massachusetts. And what I did is I shot video, and what I was able to do is review the video, and I was able to see some of the cars that are sitting here in North Carolina, the ones that I shot video of, some of them. So some of them are part of the blue unit, some are part of the red unit. You can read the whole article in the Train Aficionado blog, and you can see all those cars. This is kind of like a teaser to the blog, but definitely check this out. I mean, it's quite interesting history. I'm thinking about, either this year or the beginning of next year, making another trip out to revisit them at Spring Hope to see what condition they're in. That's graffiti on there, and it's phenomenally crazy how, there's it's, and we've got more pictures on the blog.
Yeah,
so that's.
Yeah, and these aren't particularly. These are actually, they're old cars too. I mean, these cars were used when the Ringling Brothers bought them, and I mean, they never bought anything new like that. So they were all old and rehabbed from that. So
I mean, so they were used from the, and then for the railroad, to not to do anything with it. was kind of crazy. You know,
Yeah.
I don't know why they would put it there, and then to think that nobody would actually discover them. Um,
Yep.
yeah. There's a whole bunch of cars in there. I mean, most of the coaches were built by the St. Louis rail car company in
Right.
1964. They were originally 44-seat passenger coach cars used by the Union Pacific Railroad, and then later purchased. Now listen to this. So it was the hand-me-downs of the Union Pacific Railroad, then was later purchased by Amtrak, and then it was bought out, by Ringling
Yeah.
Brothers. So it went through a couple of hands before they refabricated these cars.
Yeah. I mean, they were 50 years old by the time the state bought them, and they're not getting any younger.
Yeah, I would really, that was my, there was a lot of things that I brought up in this blog entry, questions. What was the state's plan for this? What was,
Yeah.
and there's tons of photos in the blog. I figured, we could post the photos here, but why not check out the blog? I mean, I
Yeah,
would
there you
say
go.
the North Carolina Transportation Museum would be a great home for them. And the other thing is, I'm sure Ringling Brothers would allow them to reprint the decals because I believe everything on the inside
Yeah.
of the train is still intact. All they would have to do is just fix up the outside, repaint
Yeah.
it, clean it up,
Clean it up.
and then put the decals back on it, and then it'll
Yeah,
be
and I
back to
don't
new.
think they'd have any problem getting permission from Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey to do that. So,
It's crazy. But that's our Forgotten Railroads. Let's dive into the photo archive this evening. And then what we'll do is we'll jump into some of your questions towards the end of the program this evening. So, Rich, we're going back to 1989.
all right. So there's two reasons why I chose this particular set of pictures. Number one, I was going through all my my pictures that I got back from the processing company after I had them scanned in, and I also made some exchanges with my buddy Dale, and I'm going to give him a shout out. As part of it, he sent me a couple of his patches from the Highway Patrol and a challenge coin. So there's a Montana Highway Patrol challenge coin. If you're not familiar with the concept of challenge coins, the idea is that you keep them with you, and if you get challenged from somebody you recognize as being part of the organization or the group or something, you're the one, and you don't have your challenge coin, you got to buy the drinks. So if you're in one of those situations, make sure you have your challenge coin. Otherwise, you're going to be buying drinks for everybody. I have a couple other challenge coins, and the only other one that I had out right now was one of our customers from Hawaii sent me one from the Hawaii, the Honolulu police.
That's cool.
From a while back. So these are about the size of a silver dollar. And there are people who collect challenge coins. I have several of them that I've gotten from customers or from friends and stuff. So I want to build a plaque for them because they are. I think they're awesome. So Dale, a shout out to you, my friend. Thank you very much, and hope you got the package I sent you. And again, many thanks. So in that respect, let's go to Livingston, Montana.
Yeah, so let's take a look. So here's a lay of the land right here. Looks like a junction point. I love when there's a Y.
Yes.
And there's one right here.
Yeah. So if you're right, see right where I'm pointing, guys, right there. So
Where should I point, Rich?
at the Y. At the Y.
Right
there
here.
you go, right
Whoops.
there. Yeah. Oh,
Hold on.
Too far.
Yeah, because it flipped back on me. Hold on one second. There we go.
All right. So that was a little preview of what's coming up, guys. So that's the Y, and that's where basically what you do is you have it's like a T intersection. But remember, trains can't just go up someplace and turn left like a car can. A train has to make a kind of a curve to get to that. So what they do is they put tracks so that the trains can go in any direction. So if you got a train that's going eastbound, it can go continue east onto that track, or it can turn to the left and go south on the other track. And so any train can go in any direction from there. And they can also use a Y to turn trains or just locomotives without having a turntable. So you can turn on to one end of the Y, back into the other leg of the Y, and then head the other way to turn the locomotive around. If they don't have a turntable or there's not one close by, they can do that. So you'll see the yard up there.
I've been on a commuter rail train where the head-end control car wasn't working properly, and I took a trip around the Y.
Yeah.
And that was a lot of fun.
A couple of years ago, we rode the Grand Canyon Railway up to the Grand Canyon, and I was talking to the conductor, and I said, "How long after they let the train, people off the train, do they Y the train to go?" He said, "Oh, we'll do that right away." And I said, "Do you mind if I ride with you on that?" And he said, "You know what? You're not the only guy to ask that." So they have rail fans ask that all the time. So when they let everybody else off the train, we stayed on the train. They wired the train and backed it up, and we rode it for another 20 minutes after that. So I was more interested in the train than the canyon.
I can understand that.
Yeah. So you see, I-90 is the red line towards the bottom. That's the interstate, and then of course you got the main street, which. I don't remember the names of the road there. It's been a long time since I've been there, but you'll see the diagram with the shop facilities, which is at the top of the railroad yard, and then the actual switching yard at the bottom. So yeah, if you go the mouse above that a little bit, no, the other way. There you go. Yeah, right there. We see where the tracks kind of head towards the north, the top, and then they go into the building. Those are the shops. Locomotive shops, and that's now the Montana Livingston Rebuild Center, the LRC, and they rebuild locomotives and such. So I'm not sure if they're still operating that or not. And then they got the freight yards there, and smack dab in the middle of that is the big depot, which we'll see a picture of in a little bit.
Okay.
And there's the depot. So when you're in Livingston, this was what the depot looked like in 1989. I haven't been there in a long time, so I don't know if it still looks like that or not. But that's the depot and the shops behind it, and you can see some BN trains. Now, even though this is on the Montana Rail Link and pretty much smack dab in the middle of the Montana Rail Link, the way the MRL operated is that was all former BN track and originally Northern Pacific. And Montana Rail Link leased it from the BN and operates it. And a lot of their traffic is bridge line traffic. So a lot of BN trains still operate on this former BN track, but but now it's MRL track. So it's kind of like a trackage rights and overhead rights. And back in the 80s and early 90s, it was the C30s, SD40s, and SD45s were the big power up there. So that was, that was pretty cool. And let's go to the next one. And that is the yards and shops. So you can see the shop building in the background, and you see some MRL power along. Most of it is BN power up there, but there is some MRL power and some MRL cars there. And the Montana Rail Link also had the Iowa, Chicago, and Eastern, and Dakota, Minnesota, and Eastern railroads before they sold those to the CP Rail. All right, so here's a couple of the MRL locomotives that I saw that day. The 608 was a former EJ&E SD9. I actually got a cab ride on that years ago when it was still owned by the EJ&E. I ran into a switching crew, and they gave me a cab ride, which I thought was pretty darn cool. And then the picture on the top is an SD35. It's the Montana Rail 703. Again, these are 30-year-old slides that were sitting in my garage for the last 30 years. So the color started to fade on them a little bit. And we'll go to the next one. And this is the a little bit west of town. We found a rise, the picture on the right anyway, we found a rise where it was a good shot. And one of the crew members that we met back in Livingston suggested this location was a great photo spot. So we went out there. Well, the guy that we met used to work on the Arkansas, Missouri, which is a short line out in Arkansas. And my buddy Jim, who you could see his shadow on that picture on the right, he was wearing a Arkansas and Missouri T-shirt. And now we've been on the road for a week or so, and showers were not real high on our list of priorities. So, and Jim was probably 2 or 3 days into this T-shirt, and this guy wanted that T-shirt. I got to have that T-shirt. And we're like, oh, yeah, okay. So here, let me give you, let me look. And he got into his bag and said, I've got an MRL timetable. I've got this, I've got that. And he gave me gave Jim an MRL timetable, a Burlington Northern timetable, and some other bling. And I think he had a hat that he traded for this dirty shirt Jim was wearing on. So he had to go back to his car and grab another shirt. So that was one of our big things. And this guy told us to go here to see the pictures. And then that picture on the left was taken a little bit closer into town. And again, it's a BN train smoking it up going up the hill. So there you see a former BN switcher as an SW1200. It's the MRL 15. Interesting, when I looked up this on the internet the other day to make sure I got the provenance right on it, it was one of the very few MRL units that I couldn't find a picture of it on Railpix, which is usually pretty darn good about that kind of stuff, but they had it. The picture on the right, the reason I included this one is take a look at that very last locomotive that's connected to the Santa Fe hopper cart. That's the 4005. That is a B30-7A. And the reason it's a B30-7A and not a B30-7B is because the A on that particular thing doesn't stand for an A unit or a B unit. It's the A is the 12-cylinder version of that locomotive. So it was a 12-cylinder locomotive instead of a 16, which most of those are. But you'll notice that there's no cab on that locomotive. Yep. It's a cabless locomotive, which the BN and the Santa Fe were the last railroads to do that on a relatively large scale. All right, now this is a great story, and you'll love this one. So that's my buddy Jim, and he and I were out rail fanning. I took this picture, and Jim was trying to figure out, why are you taking a picture of me? There's no train. So then he looks and turns around and sees this cow coming at him. And now Jim is a city boy. I was kind of a country boy. I can milk a cow, okay? It didn't bother me. But Jim had never seen a cow up close and personal before. And now all of a sudden he's got one coming around the ridge. And this cow's just walking up to us like, okay, guys, what are you doing here? And Jim saw this cow, and then he ran and got back to me. And he's doing one of these things, hiding behind me. And at that time, I was just as skinny as he was. So he wasn't doing a good job of hiding. He was deathly afraid of this damn cow. And this cow just kind of walks right up to us and says, hey, boys, what are y'all doing up here? And Jim had never seen a cow in person before in his life. And he was just like, oh, the only time he'd ever seen one was on television. So he was, he didn't know what to do with this damn thing. So he just stood behind me. And eventually the cow got bored. But, I mean, he sat there for a couple minutes and watched the train go by. And, well, it's not a he. If it's a cow, it's a she. And she just kind of watched that train go by and just turned around and walked on the other side of the hill to wherever cows go when they're not watching trains.
That is super cool. Let's and I believe that wraps up your archive for this week. This month.
Week, yep.
We're going to be able to see more of Rich's photos as he has nearly 10,000 of them. So we'll be highlighting those in the new year in 2021. Make sure you sign up for the Train Aficionado Trackside Bulletin. It's our email newsletter, and you can sign up at trainaficionado.com. Great thing to be able to sign up and do that through our website. So make sure you sign up for our newsletter. Do that at the end of the broadcast. You'll be able to find it right on the Train Aficionado website. Tonight we have a special feature, some viewer photos. This is from Kingston, New York, along the CSX, River line. So these are some great pictures provided by one of our viewers, Alicia. She's a viewer of the Scanner Guys and also of the Train Aficionado shows. So the River Line, I've rail fanned this line, but not this far north on the line. It's a really good amount of traffic for CSX. Probably some of the best traffic in the Northeast for CSX. Massachusetts are not as frequent as they are on the River Line in New York. So to be able to get this, so she gave us a little bit of a description. The freight line runs along the western side of the Hudson River, from Southkirk, New York, to northern New Jersey, and it has a very large yard in Selkirk. And the trains there will go east to west, and then, of course, the River Line goes north to south. And this right here is a junction point in Albany, New York, where the River Line will go south from Albany and then all the way down to New Jersey. So she monitors the rail traffic on the frequencies listed there, and whenever she goes rail fanning, she does it safely with a safety vest and a scanner in pocket. Scanners are definitely key in this hobby, so if you're not using a scanner, make sure you do that. So some of the photos that's taken in the next slides are in the rail yard in Kingston, New York. We're going to take a look at those now, and you can see a lay of the land there on the right-hand side of the River Line through that area. The yard is, let me just put the mouse, the yard is right here, and then the railroad crossing is right here where she's taken a few of these photos. So we'll be able to take a look at this on the next upcoming slides. Whoops, you be careful with this mouse. Sometimes it skips ahead. So here we go. We got a photo of a CSX train parked in the yard. This is a photo that she's taken. Actually, I don't have the date correct on there. She's taken that in 2011, I believe. I think I mistyped the date. Just ignore that. And here's another.
CP40, yeah.
And here's another photo of a southbound freight passing through the yard. Looks like a really good rail fanning spot here. She's got to definitely, to be able to see the yard and be able to see some stuff passing through the main line. And then here's another great photo of that crossing. Some southbound freight traveling through here. Looks like a good spot to be able to go rail fanning up there. I haven't rail fanned that far north on the River Line. I've rail fanned further down, and you can actually see the Hudson River. And on the other side of the Hudson River, you could see Amtrak going through, and then Metro North. So on one side you have all the freight. On the other side, you have all the passengers. So, I saw tons of passenger service in Massachusetts. So, I was on the freight side.
Yeah.
Next Wednesday, I should say, our Scanner Guys will be live. Aviation monitoring from loading to landing. We're going to cover it all Wednesday, December the 9th, 8 p.m. Eastern Time, 5 p.m. Pacific, live on the Scanner Guys YouTube channel. So this is going to be a good week this week. We go from trains to planes on Wednesday. So we hope that you're able to join us. So if you're just getting into aviation monitoring, this is going to be a great show to learn more about how to listen to them on a scanner. So this will be a good program for you to watch. So that's Wednesday night, December the 9th, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific, live right on the Scanner Guys YouTube channel.
Okay.
So, we've reached the tail end of the slideshow presentation. So let's dive into some of the questions that we've had during the broadcast.
Alrighty. Well, let's start off. Say hi to our buddy Chris. He's doing a countdown for the show before the show started. One neat thing with the way we're doing things is you can actually put comments in before the show starts. So thanks for Chris for taking care of the countdown for us. Joe checked in from New York. And Les is saying hello to us and all the rail fans. Carmen is on the Norfolk Southern Tier line. I think that's through the Southern Tier of New York. He's from milepost 290.55. That is the former D&H.
I'm not
Southern Tier. I'm not that sure. I've been through there, but it's been a long, long time. And see our next show. Yes, Chris, it's going to be on the Monday the 4th. Is that right? Monday the 4th?
Yeah, let me look at the calendar. Yep, the first Monday of the month is the 4th.
Cool. So that's going to be it. Mark says hello. Hello from our buddy Dale from Montana. We've already spoken of him tonight. Carmen asked that the Surface Transportation Board approved the sale yet. We were talking earlier about the CSX buying out the Pan Am. No, it has not yet been approved. So as we mentioned earlier, it'll probably be sometime in 2021 before that happens, and probably towards the later part of the year before that gets approved. These things typically take at least a year to get through. So Les asked if we knew that the CN Rail took over the Toronto, Hamilton, and Buffalo. It was my understanding that was actually the Canadian Pacific, if I recall correctly. So I'm looking that up as we speak now. But the Toronto, Hamilton, and Buffalo was a railroad that ran in the greater Toronto area on the southern part of the lake. And when I first started rail fanning up in that area, they were still operating some of their locomotives, but it had already been taken over. And let's see here. So, yeah, it was the Canadian Pacific. It was actually jointly owned by the Canadian Pacific and the New York Central. And the Canadian Pacific took over what was left of it by then. But, yeah, it was, I had to be back in the 80s that the TH&B became part of the CP Rail. And then Carmen wrote that the trains 20K, 22K, and the 23K will retain their trackage rights to air. So that's in your backyard, right?
Yeah, that's the trains when we were talking about going to the Hoosick Tunnel. That's Norfolk Southern. And when the tunnel was out, because of that partial collapse in a section of the tunnel, they were doing this huge detour. They were running up into Vermont and then back down again. I mean, it was crazy. I mean, it was to the point where Norfolk Southern, had on their website, any shipments, to the Northeast to air could be delayed up to 24 hours because.
Well, they've got the tunnel open again, right?
Yeah, the tunnel is open again. I mean, it's had a couple of collapses. This is the latest one, basically. It just got the roof of the tunnel in a certain section just kind of let go, and they had to clean that out, and then they had to readjust everything in there,
shore up the roof and everything. I
mean,
that's actually a pretty common thing for a lot of tunnels.
I mean, it's a huge tunnel. I mean, it's nearly 5 miles.
Oh yeah, there's not many tunnels that big. So Ray lives in suburban Chicago, and I know the area that he lives in, and they have the Canadian National owns the track through his town, the north-south track, and the east-west track. There's 2 east-west tracks, one that kind of runs northeast, southeast, another one that runs southwest, northeast. Those are both owned by Union Pacific, And they also have Canadian Pacific and Metro trains going through there. So he's got a lot of railroad activity in his town. And he's got a scanner that can listen to that stuff. So, Ray, make sure you listen to the scanner for the railroad stuff. So Vance says he likes the old Santa Fe paint job. Yeah, the Santa Fe has had 3 paint schemes over their history of their own main ones. There's been some variations and stuff. They had the original passenger scheme, which was the war bonnet, the silver and red, and then they had the freight version, which was the yellow and blue, and there was a black version too for some of the freights before. And then later on, they brought back that silver and red to the Superfleet train. So I've got some pictures of that Superfleet stuff from the first Superfleet trains. Maybe we'll do that next time out. The Norfolk Southern kills it when it comes to the heritage units. Yeah, they hit the nail on the head with that. They did a great job with that. So kudos to the Norfolk Southern for that. Brian is in Iowa, and I think he's in the Boone, Iowa area. And he says the UP passenger steam engine came through there last year. So that was when that was the 4014. That was the big boy that they rebuilt, and they bought back from the museum or from the city that they had donated it to, rebuilt the thing, and they ran it at a big loop around the country on their track, and they ran it up to Minneapolis and Michigan, Wisconsin, and into Illinois, and took off west and all over the whole system. And boy, they did a nice job rebuilding that.
Yeah, the funny thing about that, I was talking to one of the people that works at the North Carolina Transportation Museum, and because that particular locomotive does not have the track control equipment on it at all, they have to get permission from the federal government to run it. So they were going through all the paperwork to be able to run that on because of the positive train control. It doesn't have it. Right. So they were going through all the paperwork of doing that, and they said, UP, you own the track. You really don't need to do this. You have the insurance on your own track. You're running the risk on your own track. You really don't need to do this unless you go outside of your track. And then you need to do it. So they ended up going through the whole entire process. How this came up in conversation was, will they ever run 611 on the main line on its own independent power? And they said they can. They would have to get federal government clearance in order to do so because it doesn't have positive train control on it at all.
Yeah, there's a lot of regulations. And a lot of it isn't just federal regulations. A lot of it has to do with insurance.
Yeah, and that's the whole thing. If something happens on that line, they're responsible for that. So I would love to see...
That's why there's a lot less special trains on the railroads these days.
That's for sure.
Back in the comments, Ray does acknowledge he's got Metro up there, and then in Chicago they have electric. So there are some electric heavy rail activity in Chicago area. It's the IC Electric. It runs south from Chicago, through the south part of the city, and then out to University Park. And so that's the only electric heavy rail they've got in Chicago, and then they've got, of course, you got the L, the subway trains in the L. But there was talk in the 40s, 50s, 60s of electrifying some of the other railroad lines through Chicago, kind of like what they did with New York, but it just never happened. They were talking about electrifying the Northwestern and a couple of the other lines because the amount of traffic there, but it was just too expensive, so they just never got around to doing it. Brian says back in the 70s and 80s, there was a train company that made train reels. They just dropped the stuff into the big metal cart. That had to be a loud kaboom when those things hit, right? You ever seen a size of a rail reel? I mean, those things are 5 and 6 feet tall. They're huge, and they weigh tons. So, yeah, you drop one of those things, Don't drop it on your toe. It's going to hurt. We already spoke about Amtrak being part of the Class 1s. Tony loves the Norfolk Southern logo. And we already answered Randy's question about the Pacific and the railroad names. So we already answered this question too from Vance. BNSF. Carmen's there. Better not send freight. So Chris asks if Amtrak owns their tracks in Chicago. No, they don't own the tracks in Chicago. They own Union Station, and they own some of the tracks right there around Union Station, of course. But they don't own the rest of the tracks that they operate on in the Chicago area. But you go east of Chicago, and the trains, and then as the track going into Michigan, they own the track from Porter, Indiana, which is just south of Michigan line, and then up into the Michigan area to run the trains going up to Canada. So they own that track, and then, of course, they own the Northeast Corridor. That's pretty much about it for the track that Amtrak owns.
Yeah, there's not a lot. I read a really good book. I can't remember the name of the author, but it's called Waiting on a Train. Mm-hmm. And basically, other than the tracks that they own, for the most part, with these long haul lines, typically the Empire Builder and so on, they're guests on those tracks, and they don't have priority. So that's why you'll see, if you look at any of these Amtrak tracking maps that they have out there, you'll see a lot of trains running late because they're waiting on freight trains. They don't have priority. If you listen to radio communication along the Northeast Corridor, Amtrak rules the roost. Even when it comes to the MBTA's commuter rail, they have to let the Acela go through or the regional go through ahead of them. It's one of the few places in the country where Amtrak rules the roost. Everywhere else, it's secondary.
Yeah, they own the track, so they make the rules. So
yes, and it's their dispatchers too, for the most part. So they got to make sure that their company equipment's running on time.
Yeah. Now, with that being said, Metra, who runs the commuter trains in the Chicago area, they do own some of the track that they operate on. So Metra owns the former Milwaukee Road from Fox Lake to Roundout, which is near Libertyville, and then into the city. They also own the Milwaukee Road west from Chicago into and through Elgin, and then it ends just west of Elgin. They also own the IC Electric line, or what used to be the IC Electric line. It's now called Metra Electric. And I'm pretty sure they also own the Heritage Corridor, which is the former Alton diesel route. So they own those tracks. What they don't own is their busiest lines, and that is the Chicago Northwestern, all three lines on the Northwestern, the Burlington, and then the Burlington line. And those are the busiest lines on the system. The Burlington is the busiest, and then the three Northwestern lines are really, really busy. They don't own those tracks. Those are owned by the Burlington, Northern Santa Fe, and the Union Pacific, and that causes some disruption as well. So, Les asks if we knew that the Via Railroad in Ontario back in the 70s, they gave it passenger service. So, yeah, very much like Amtrak. In Canada, the freight railroads at the time obviously owned the track and ran the passenger trains, and they were losing money on passenger trains. So they formed Via a couple years after they did Amtrak, and Via took over most of the passenger operations from the Canadian National and Canadian Pacific, and bought new equipment, convinced the railroads to fix things up, and pretty much made a better passenger train experience than you were getting with the CP and the CN. I've ridden some Via trains, and they did a nice job back then. I haven't ridden it in a long time, but when I have run it, they were pretty good. Brian says Boone, Iowa seems to be a big railroad area. Yeah, that was a big Chicago and Northwestern town, and there was a couple short lines up there as well. But yeah, that's a busy railroad area. Lincoln checks in from San Diego. Howdy, howdy. Cameron writes that the Penn Central may not have been a success, but they're always got a special place in his heart. They and the Erie Lackawanna, which is another railroad that became part of Conrail, ran through his town as a kid, and that got him hooked. So it was the Penn Central, and then they were forced to take over the New Haven Railroad at the same time. So it was Pennsylvania, the New York Central, and the New Haven were part of Penn Central. And then Conrail was formed from Penn Central, the Central Railroad in New Jersey, Jersey Central, Erie Lackawanna. I think Ann Arbor was part of that. And, oh, God, no, I'm forgetting something. What other railroads? Oh, Reading lines.
I can't.
And Pensy Reading Seashore lines, which is the one that everybody always forgets because it was the smallest of the bunch. Those all became part of Conrail, and then Ann Arbor kind of bounced out of that, and so did the Providence and Worcester.
It's Providence, Worcester.
Yeah, that's what I said, the Worcester. Yeah,
Worcester.
The P&W. That was a paper subsidiary of one of those railroads. I don't know which one owned it at the time, but they were a paper subsidiary, and the company that owned the actual railroad, it was leased to New York Central or Pennsylvania, I don't remember which. They said, no, we're not going to let that become part of Conrail. We think we can make money on it. And so they formed their own operating company to run that railroad. So, yeah, it was owned and operated by the companies that became part of Conrail, but then when Conrail came up, they decided to go their own way.
Yeah, and they've been there ever since, pretty much.
Yeah, so obviously they've been working. They can just learn how to pronounce the name, everybody will be all set.
It's okay.
That's an ongoing joke with what was your name again? Jonathan.
The scanner
Jonathan.
Guys. Yeah, that's
the scanner guys. So I'm the only guy in the company that's not from Massachusetts, so I can't pronounce their names.
Yeah, I mean that's a really cool thing with Providence Worcester. You know, I mean they didn't run as frequently. I would have loved to rail fan the line that basically ran from Worcester to Providence, but they didn't run services frequently on the weekends at all, so it was hard to catch them. I mean, they did have some that ran on the weekend, during the week, but it was typically at night, so it wasn't that great for photographing. But yeah, I mean, there's another short line. I can't think of the name of it now. That's in Massachusetts. That's doing pretty well. It escapes me now what the name of it is now.
Oh, one of our viewers might know what it is. So, alrighty. So, Dale writes about the Montana Rail Link merging into the BNSF. I mean, it could happen, but I don't think it would. But you never know. Other railroads have bought back stuff that they sold off. Buyer's remorse. Have you ever, traded in a car and then 6 weeks later you say, "Oh man, I wish I still had that truck that I just traded in," and then you want to go back to the dealership and buy it again.
Grafton Upton Railroad is the short line.
I've actually did that where I've donated stuff to the Salvation Army, and then a week later, I realized I still needed it, and I went back to the store, and sure enough, it was on this shelf, so I ended up buying it again. Okay, so Brian got to see the circus train go through his town years ago. He thought it was pretty cool. Too bad it doesn't run anymore.
There is, I was able to catch the other traveling circus. Actually made its trip through Landis. I was able to grab a photo of that. That's the
James Straits?
Yes, that Carmen mentioned. We traveled through Landis, North Carolina. I was able to. I was with my dad and we pulled off. And I said, "Oh, I think there's a train coming." And then, sure enough, I was like, "Oh my God, I got a circus train!" Because it is a rarity to be able to get. Like the circus trains are very much like getting a photo of Air Force One, and how that basically works with the circus train is they only own the cars of the fleet. They don't have their own locomotives, so there's always whoever operates the rail line, whether it's CSX or Norfolk Southern, will be pulling the train. And I was able to grab that circus train, traveling right through Landis. This was probably shortly after moving here. But yeah, I mean, it was an all-day affair trying to get the circus train, its last final run when it went through Worcester, and it went back to through in Providence, Rhode Island, and went down that line, from Worcester to Providence, and it was going out to Springfield. So it did a show up in New Hampshire, and then went to Springfield. So I got it in Worcester, and then I tried to beat it to get to the steaming tender restaurant in Palmer. I pulled into Palmer, got off the highway, coming up the road. I could set to see the downtown, and I just missed it.
Yeah. Back in the 70s, the Chicago and Northwestern used to run the Circus World Museum trains. And what they would do is the Circus World Museum was in a little town called Baraboo, Wisconsin, which is, if you know where Madison, Wisconsin is, it's another 100 miles away from there. And they would run the train to a parade, and it was usually, if I recall correctly, I think that circus parade was done in Milwaukee. I'm sure somebody else will know. But they would run that train down into the Chicago area and then to back up to Milwaukee, or the other way around. And when I was working for the police department in one of the online towns called Park Ridge, I got assigned to do a escort from a nursing home that was on one side of the road across from the tracks to escort the residents over to see the train in a safe location. And I'm like, yeah, cool. This is great. I can bring my camera with me and watch the train while I, help these people across the street. And it was a great time. And there was all the circus wagons are all on the flat cars. It wasn't the Ringling Brothers Barnum Bailey. It was the Circus World Museum with all the old stuff that they ran for the parade, which was pretty cool. And they ran that for several years. I caught several times. So Brian writes that the Christmas train stops at his place every year, but it's been canceled for this year, of course, with COVID and everything. What they would do is they'd open the railroad car doors and they have a band that played music, So that's about as musical as I get. So Randy rode, when he said he rode the Grand Canyon Railway, they turned the train before letting anybody off. So the time that I rode that, where we rode through the Y, is when they had the steam engine. It was the old Ellison steam engine that they had running at the time. And so we were running behind the steam engine. So that's why I wanted to ride it too. And at that time they rode it, they took it straight in, and then they would back the train back out and back it around so that they would Y the train. So I think on the diesel trains they do that. They Y it first and back the train in. But at that time they ran the steam engine directly in. So Dale writes, when we're talking about the MRL, it's apparently their Montana Rail Link crews that operate the BNSF trains on the Montana Rail Link track. So that makes sense. So basically the BNSF has got overhead rights. So the trains are actually operated by MRL people. And a lot of times they'll be BN Power or BNSF Power, but it's still going to be Montana Rail Link crews. And then he asked if I shot the tunnel on Bozeman Pass. Yeah, I did on that same trip, and I've been there once again after that. So I do have pictures of it someplace, but I hadn't dug that deep into my collection yet. So Carmen writes that the CP holiday train is going to be virtual this year. Oh, I like that. Hey, pull up the train at Fort Madison, Iowa next.
Okay.
You'll see their Christmas decorations. So there's the Christmas decorations in LaGrange, Kentucky.
Yeah, and this is courtesy of our friends over at Virtual Railfan. We're looking at a live view right now. Apparently, I must have missed it, but they usually have a lighting ceremony, and then they dress up the fire truck for a parade. I'm not too sure if they actually did it this year because of all the COVID stuff. Yeah. But they have a parade that comes through. Yeah. The fire truck is all decked out with lights, and everything is all dressed up. I believe it was last year. The parade just got done, and there was people on both sides of the road, and then you had the train come through after the parade, which was a really good, shot here. So what's the other camera, Rich? Do you want me to bring up?
Fort Madison, Iowa. It's great. You'll love it.
All right, I'll bring that up while we're answering some more questions.
All right. So Art says hello, the rail nerds. That is actually a badge of honor, so we appreciate that. Oh, and that Southern Tier was former Erie and Delaware Lackawanna, or Erie Lackawanna track on that Southern Tier. Thanks for clearing that up, Carmen. Yeah, I couldn't remember whose track that was back then. So, Ray writes he's got 2 train museums in his area. So yeah, he's got the Illinois Railroad Museum, which is up in Union, Illinois, which is the largest railroad museum in the country. And then there's the Fox River Valley Trolley Museum. So there's Fort Madison, Iowa. And you can see cars going across the bridge in the background. And then there's their Christmas decorations. Boy, they did a nice job with that, didn't they?
Yeah, it's really cool to be able to see that. I really love, being able to see, these towns, especially in Kentucky there, being able to see, the downtown all decked out. This is a really cool display, and you can see this on our friend's Virtual Railfan. That's one of these 2 cameras that we showed this evening are cameras that you can see on YouTube. So make sure you hit the subscribe button as well on their channel, along with ours. But yeah, this is a live look courtesy of Virtual Railfan.
And this is a great camera to watch, especially in the daytime, because you see the cars going across in the background. That's a bridge across the Mississippi River. And on the upper deck is the rail bridge. And on the lower deck is the car bridge. And it's all, right there. And it's actually a swing bridge. So when there's a barge or a towboat going through on the river, they open up that bridge on it, and it swings on the pivot. And then the boats can go through on the river. So right behind this is the Mississippi River. It's kind of hard to see during the nighttime, but this is a busy a railroad location, and during the summertime months especially, it's busy out on the river. So it's a great cam to watch. And now, of course, we got the Christmas decorations.
Oh, very cool.
All righty. So Bearable Cruising writes, he rode via rail from Vancouver to Edmonton, Alberta. Great trip across the Rockies. Yeah. That is on my bucket list, but I always wanted to do that. Never got a chance. I've rail fanned that area, but I've never got a chance to ride that. So Dave has got pictures of the circus train going through Peru, Indiana, and stopping to change screws and water the elephant. So yeah, they brought their live animals. You got the regular circus animals. Animals and lions and tigers and elephants and giraffes and stuff. So they got to take care of their animals.
Yeah, towards the tail end, they really didn't transport the animals via train just because of the accommodations were quite lacking, I would say. For the animals, so it wasn't that comfortable for them.
Yeah, but I mean, it was pretty cool to see. It had to be cool to see him watering an elephant on the train. So that would have been a great shot. So look at that.
And there's Ashland, Virginia. They do have some lights here. They're continuing to do the construction around the train depot. As you can see there, they've redid the platform there on the side that's closest to us on the shot. And then I visited this location. It looks so much bigger on camera And then when you're there, it's a small, tiny little town. But once again, this is another camera from Virtual Railfan. Thank you so much for just letting us dive in live as...
you know what? They are... I mean, I've got two TVs on my wall I'm looking at two different cameras. And I have those on my entire day when I'm here in the office. And it's such a great thing they've got going there. So if you like trains, you'll love Virtual Railfan.
Yeah, I mean, they have several cameras that are sponsored on YouTube, but there is a whole bunch of cameras that you can become a premium subscriber, and you can learn about that at virtualrailfan.com. They are not a sponsor. Rich and I are both extreme fans of Virtual Railfan and Railstreams, which is the competitor of Virtual Railfan.
Yeah, they aren't paying us, but boy, they are good.
Yeah, they are great. That's for sure.
Yeah. All right. So Tim writes, back in the 60s, you remember trains going through Canton, Ohio. Isn't that where the Football Hall of Fame is?
I don't know.
Canton, Ohio? Yeah.
You're asking that. Me neither. You're asking the wrong
dude. So in Canton, Ohio, somebody would get off the train at night and swing a lantern at the crossings. So certain crossings had to be, and that's called flagging. And during the daytime, they'd have red flags on poles and they'd do that. But at nighttime, people can't see that, so they have to do it with a lantern. And nowadays, it's done with electric. But back in the old days, they were done with gas lanterns. Or oil lanterns, but nowadays, of course, those are all electric, battery powered. But yeah, that would be called flagging the crossings. If they don't have crossing gates or flashing lights in some areas, they'd have to actually flag the crossings. So Gary likes our show tonight. Thanks, Gary. Appreciate that. Lehigh Valley, that was another railroad I missed out of Conrail. So yeah, Lehigh Valley, and I don't know why I missed them. I was a big fan of Lehigh Valley back then. Yeah, good old Park Ridge. Yeah, I used to. I worked at Park Ridge for 5 years, and it was a nice job. And Lakescan is in Australia. The government removed the rail line into the center of town and replaced it with a light rail, or as they call it, a tram. Mm-hmm. So that's not all that unusual. There are several instances here in the States of former freight railroads being converted into passenger, commuter trains or light rail trains. They did that in San Diego. They did that a few other places. Pennsylvania, I think the Pittsburgh area or the Philadelphia area, they've done that. So that's really not that uncommon. The line is already there, and if the freight railroads don't need it, they can convert it over to commuter operations. They did something like that in Albuquerque. The city or the transit district or state bought a railroad track and fixed it up to run commuter trains. And then now they own that track, and the freight railroad pays them to operate any of their freight trains through there. So Randy mentioned we were talking about the Grand Canyon Railway. So apparently at some point they did bring the train straight in, and other times they widened the train before they let the passengers in and out. So on mine, they ran it straight in, and then I just stick with the train while they widened after they let the rest of the passengers off. And we were talking about the Fort Madison. If you've got ATCS or Automatic Train Control System monitor, ATCS monitor, which is a program that you can run on your computer, you can actually view what's going on a lot of these different tracks. And Fort Madison area is one of them. And we've spoken about this a little before. ATCS is where it's a data signal that's being transmitted by the railroads, and they use that instead of having wires going all along the railroad. And they can use that for signal indication, track switch positions, and other information. And scanner people have figured out how to make that stuff work, and we can decode that data and display it on the map. It looks just like a dispatcher display. and it's really kind of a neat thing.
Yeah, it certainly is. If you haven't looked at that and you're a rail fan, take a look at ATCS. There is a online version of it, Train Mod 5, that you can check out as well. But you have to be a member of their group in order to access the other portion of it. Certainly really cool. I mean, I'm privileged enough to have the line that runs through my town here to be able to monitor it on there, and it's I still feel like it's rail fanning cheating because I can see what's coming at me and how busy or how dead it is, and how it looks.
Hey, it's not cheating if it helps you, right?
Yeah, that's for sure.
So that's what we got for the comments. Thanks to everybody and for their comments, and we will always acknowledge everybody that we can, and so that's what we do.
And we want to thank once again Virtual Railfan. We kind of did that on the fly, just showing their images. So giving credit to Virtual Railfan, just being able to show real quick those shots. So definitely hop over to their YouTube channel to check out some rail fanning locations that they have available through their channel. The great thing about it is if you're in a colder environment and it's a bit chilly to be out there rail fanning, this is the next best thing to be able to do that. Let's remind you of a couple of things that we have going on this week. Our transportation continues with our other channel, which is the Scanner Guys. We're going to be talking about aviation from loading to landing, everything you need to know scanner-wise. So if you're interested in aviation, definitely watch us on the Scanner Guys YouTube channel. Rich and I will be back on that channel Wednesday the 9th, 8 p.m. Eastern Time, 5 p.m. Pacific. Make sure you subscribe to the Train Aficionado channel and make sure you do the same on the Scanner Guys channel. And the Scanner Guys are on each and every Wednesday night. The show that we're on is on every first Monday of the month. Make sure you follow and like and subscribe to Train Aficionado on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Instagram. We're always posting some good stuff there. And then, of course, check out the blog at trainaficionado.com. Subscribe to our newsletter on trainaficionado.com as well. And as I mentioned, and also our good friend Chris pointed out at the beginning of the broadcast, our next broadcast for Train Aficionado Live is Monday, January the 4th of 2021. We're finally out of the next time we see you on this channel, unless we throw together a broadcast unexpectedly, will be in 2021. So it'll be 8 p.m. Eastern Time, 5 p.m. Pacific. And hit that subscribe button. Make sure you do that right now. And that is it there. We want to thank you once again for joining us. Just a quick question here. Do trolleys count as trains?
Well, you know what? They're not trains in the usual sense because trains are usually considered heavy rail. But if you think it's a train, it's a train to me. He's in the San Diego area, and I've ridden the San Diego trolley. It's a great system up that they've got there. So yeah, I'd probably call it a train.
Yeah,
it runs on rails, right?
Yeah, I mean the branding line of Train Aficionado is trains, trolleys, and transit. So anything that basically runs, for my blog, anything that runs on rail, not those trolley drivable with a steering wheel type of things. I don't look at them as a trolley. A trolley is something that runs on a rail. That's for sure.
Yeah, there you go. So yeah, if you think it's a train, I think it's a train. Good enough for me.
So we will catch you again next month, next year, I should say.
Either one. You're both correct, yeah.
So we hope that you have a great night. I'm Jonathan Higgins.
I'm Rich Carlson.
We'll catch you again next year. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.